Thank you, Minister, for sharing that statement. We have some time for a few clarifications. Mr. Christopher D'Souza.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to congratulate the Minister and his ministry for helping to achieve a successful year with Singapore as ASEAN Chair. Building a rules-based region and bringing our economies closer are key and relevant initiatives. I would like to ask a supplementary question on the humanitarian aspect. May I ask the Minister what is the Ministry's view on the repatriation of the Rohingyas that has been announced to commence in mid-November 2018, and whether, from the point of view of ASEAN, enough is being done to ensure that those who return will not face the same threats to their safety as when they first left. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you. We're talking about a current and still evolving situation. As I said earlier, the silver lining, and having visited both Bangladesh and Myanmar, and having spoken to Prime Minister of Bangladesh and the State Councillor of Myanmar, is that I can state with a fair amount of confidence that both sides sincerely do want a return of the refugees. The State Councillor herself has acknowledged that they are residents of Myanmar and that they are entitled to go back. This is a brave position for her to take. Similarly, Bangladesh, as I said earlier, has done a fantastic job, a really admirable job in looking after the refugees. But they also know that it is not sustainable and that at some point the refugees need to go back. The key point is this: it has to be voluntary, it has to be safe, and it has to be dignified. I cannot give you a specific date on which it will actually begin, because apart from the preparations made by both sides, the refugees themselves have to agree and have to want to go back. And having spoken to some of the refugees also, I think the refugees' key concern is security. Having, risked life and limb to get across into the refugee camps, their question is, will it be safe for me to return? How will my neighbors, the community, the other communities in Rakhine State view their return? They've asked what will be their livelihood. Because in the end, nobody wants to be a refugee. Everyone wants to get a job, a good job, and to be able to support their family. So the point is, there are many, many details that need to be sorted out. The other point I would emphasize is the United Nations, UNHCR, High Commissioner for Refugees, and the UNDP Development Program also have to do their part. And both in terms of support and presence on the ground, but also in building confidence. We should bear in mind that there are extremists on both sides who do not want this problem to be resolved and do not want the refugees to go back early. Because as long as this problem remains unresolved, it is a festering locus for extremism and for the recruitment of future terrorists, which ultimately threatens not only the immediate neighborhood, but in fact threatens us across ASEAN. So there's a lot more details that need to be sorted. What I can say now from my own interactions is there is sincere goodwill on the part of both Myanmar and Bangladesh. We need the UN to do more. And of course, ASEAN, we will also be willing to step up. And it's ultimately about confidence and trust. And the domestic lesson for us here is you understand why we are so focused on making sure inter-ethnic and inter-religious relations are looked after so assiduously. Because once those ties the fabric is torn. It's very, very difficult to put together again.
Mr. William.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I have one clarification for Minister concerning our relationship with Indonesia, particularly on the issue of extradition. I believe about a decade ago, the Singapore and Indonesian governments agreed to tie extradition together with some defense cooperation agreements. And we've noted your update that we have concluded an ASEAN model extradition treaty. So my question is, how will this model treaty affect our attitude, our position with Indonesia as far as extradition is concerned? Does it mean that the Singapore government is prepared to proceed on extradition without it being tied to defense cooperation?
That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. They're actually two separate matters. You've been in House long enough to remember that we had actually agreed with Indonesia on two agreements, a defense cooperation agreement and an extradition treaty. They were both signed. In fact, I think in the presence of the respective leaders, Prime Minister Lee, and at that time it would have been SBY of Indonesia. Those agreements remain signed but unratified. We will have to wait for the political dynamics within Indonesia as to whether you're going to see any progress on those two bilateral agreements. What I referred to was the ASEAN Model Extradition Treaty, which in a sense forms the starting base to begin negotiations for an ASEAN extradition treaty. This will not be bilateral, this will be regional, and being a lawyer, you'll know that once it becomes regional, the scope, the conditions will be quite different from that of a bilateral treaty. So I would still keep this on two separate channels. But important point for the ASEAN extradition treaty is because we do want to emphasize the importance of rule of law and interoperability within ASEAN. But I would not conflate the two extradition treaties because I think we should keep them separate.
Because they are not going to be the same.
No, the specific terms, conditions will not be the same between the two. As a lawyer, you will know, for instance, if you want to extradite someone, you have to show that it is an offense in both sides, domestically. Now, if you say, well, you're now looking at a 10 by 10 extradition treaty, you can imagine the permutations, and the lowest common multiple will be quite different from what you would have had in a bilateral extradition treaty. So I think suffice to say here, without getting into details, our position is this: there is a bilateral DCA and a bilateral ET which was signed and witnessed by our leaders, but not yet ratified. We will wait and see what happens with that. That, however, does not mean we should not be able to proceed with negotiations for an ASEAN extradition treaty on different terms. I want to emphasize that. It's on different terms.
Mr. Ang Wei Neng.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. On the issue of refugee, I'm glad that Minister said that ASEAN countries should step up. Could I ask what kind of specific help, financial or otherwise, have other ASEAN countries other than Myanmar has pledged to assist resolve the crisis, and have any countries agreed to take in some of the refugees, Rohingya refugees selectively?
Actually, there has been a global outpouring of support for the refugees. And even from Singapore, I think you would be aware that at the grassroots level, at the NGO level, there have been fundraising and there has been support extended to the refugees. We have also extended help directly to the refugees in Bangladesh. So for instance, the RSAF conveyed a couple of shipments. I believe SMS Maliki was there at the handover. Now, specifically within Myanmar itself, when they go back, I myself haven't visited Rakhine State, But the reports that I have received is that a lot of the homes and the farms were destroyed. They actually need to rebuild homes and a means of livelihood. Right now, for instance, I know India and China are helping with constructing prefabricated homes. But actually, what is important is for the refugees themselves to be able to construct homes that, of their design and at a standard which they are accustomed to. I know one problem which I've been informed of is there's actually a lack of labor within Rakhine State to do rebuilding. And therefore, there have been proposals by the Myanmar government to, in fact, have a cash for work program so that the refugees will, in fact, be paid to rebuild, to engage in construction and reconstruction. So anyway, there will be needs, there will be appeals, but actually my sense of the issue right now is the primary limiting factor is not money. The primary limiting factor is trust. Confidence on the part of refugees and trust and the ground conditions within Rakhine State itself. So let's wait and see. But we as ASEAN should be prepared to help in whichever way possible. And sometimes, just the delivery of humanitarian assistance on the ground and having people on the ground, it's not so much the specifics of what's in the package, but the fact that someone else was there. Someone else was there in goodwill and helping to build trust. And especially, and this is another point which I want to emphasize, you must remember that there are other minorities within Rakhine State. In fact, the indigenous people in Rakhine are a minority in Myanmar. They also need support. They also need to enhance their livelihood. Again, trust requires all communities to be confident and to have a hope that there's a better future. So there's a lot more work to be done. I just wanted to clarify a little bit on the point that Sylvia raised. Let me just get this thing right. I mentioned the DCA and the extradition treaty that we signed with Indonesia. It was signed by both governments, and let me just state for the record, Singapore is prepared to proceed as and when Indonesia ratifies those two agreements. Okay, I need to just state that for the record.
Mr. Peng Eng Huat.
Thank you, sir. Can the Minister share what major points of contention were removed in the arrived single draft negotiating text of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea? And in your opinion, how far is the draft away from being adopted by all the member states?
Yes. Let me be very frank with you. Yes, it is true we've arrived at a single draft negotiating text. But let me not raise false hopes that all the issues are simple to resolve. I mean, for instance, if you speak to the different claimant states, each of them will stand up and loudly proclaim those areas are indisputably mine. In other words, even what is in dispute is disputed. Do you see my point? This is indisputably mine. And then you pick it up and say, no, this is indisputably mine. You can't even agree on what areas are in dispute. I'm just giving you an example of a very thorny issue. Other thorny issues, is this a binding agreement? And then there are enough lawyers here who should quickly say, is this a legally binding issue? And then for those of you who are lawyers in international law will know, even if you get a judgment, how will it be enforced? Who will enforce it? So I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the enormous challenges which lie ahead. Nevertheless, China has said that they hope there will be a first reading of the negotiating text next year, and they also hope it can be settled in 3 years. I think that my own view is I think that's a very optimistic scenario, but let's not prejudge the issue. As I said earlier, the fact that patient, meticulous, constructive diplomacy has at least brought us to this point where the waters of the South China Sea are much calmer is still worth noting, is still a positive step. But don't ever assume it's going to be an easy or short journey.
Mr. Vikram.
I thank the Minister for the comprehensive review of MFA's work, and I think it's important for us to stand up for multilateralism in a time when nationalism is on the rise everywhere. The question I have, though, relates to some of the issues that arose from the Singh Health inquiry and related matters. Do we still have to worry about foreign interference in our local politics? And if so, what would be the best steps our people can do to prepare for and deal with that? Thank you.
Short answer, yes. Your second question was, what steps do we need to take? I think the first point is public education, and people need to be aware that we will always be a target for campaigns and misinformation campaigns and deliberate online falsehoods. So the first thing is to be aware of it. The second point is to be skeptical of what you receive through all your social media feeds. And I remember this very good piece of advice that our former president, Dr. Tony Tan, gave. He says, when you receive a message, ask who it is from. Second, ask who it is going to benefit. Right? And of course, ask whether it's accurate or not. I don't want to prejudge other issues which will be brought to this House, but let's get real. You know, there will always be the danger for foreign interference. You have to take it almost as standard statecraft of the digital age. And if you assume that everyone is going to act with restraint, you're being very foolish.
Mr. Luisen.
Thank you, sir. Now, I want to join my fellow members here to thank Minister and MFA especially for all the work they've done to try and resolve the crisis in Rakhine State and in Bangladesh as well. But I have 3 SQs. One is that I previously asked Minister whether Singapore will be sending a second consignment of humanitarian aid to the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and the Minister at that point replied that it's pending further assessment. And now that he's been to the refugee camps, could I ask for an update on whether we'll be sending these humanitarian supplies? A second is on the repatriation, which I agree should happen, but I'm wondering whether once they're back in Rakhine State, whether there is plans to grant them citizenship. Because as Minister mentioned, that we have to address the root causes, and one of the root causes of why they fled and what the result of this crisis is because they didn't have citizenship. The third is on, in the repatriation process, whether there will be UN peacekeepers on site. I think that was one of the requests of the refugees, to ensure again that this repatriation is both safe and secure for them. Thank you.
There are 3 interesting supplementary questions. On further consignments of aid, yes, we're prepared to, but I would consider targeting the aid to the refugees when they return. What I saw in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, I know you were there, but you were there earlier last year. And according to the people on site, it's a vast difference. The conditions under which the refugees are living now is much, much better than when we first arrived. You know, I used to be former environment minister, so I noticed things like drains, latrines, water supply, food supply, cooking gas and ability. And actually there's been a lot of work that has been done with it on the Bangladesh side of it. My greater concern will be when they return, the rebuilding program and ultimately the livelihoods and making a living. With your indulgence, I really do not want to get into the issue of citizenship because that's not for us, the Parliament of Singapore, to be debating or to decide on behalf of Myanmar. This is something which they have to sort out through their own political processes. Similarly, this issue of UN peacekeepers is something, it's a sovereign issue that has to be sorted out by Myanmar. And if I were Myanmar, I would be offended. A parliament elsewhere is making pronouncements on such issues. So with your permission, I'm not going to get into those two specific issues. Always think about how we in Singapore would view others pontificating or prescribing how we should solve our own political problems.
I'll allow one last question. Mr. Liang Yinghua.
Thank you, sir. I would like to join members to congratulate the Foreign Affairs Minister for the successful 2018 in terms of foreign relations and putting Singapore on the world map. If I may ask, add on another achievements for 2018 is also the Parliament's, Singapore Parliament hosting the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly, IPA, where we not only had successful conclusion on many issues, deepening integration and so on, but also meeting up many new MPs, including those from Malaysia. So my question is on RCEP. I would like to ask the Minister, what does he see the prospect of the RCEP concluding next year? And whether in the ASEAN Leaders Summit, does he sense the political will to want to have a conclusion to that? And what could throw it off, and what could be the obstacles there? And then the final point is just to assure the Minister that as he represents Singapore in different various places, including Argentina, rest assured the GRC MP will be there covering your duties when you're not around.
Thank you for covering my numerous absences. I must tell you, I travel almost as much as cabin crew. I calculated I do about 36 visits a year. So I thank you for your personal support. But let me turn to, actually I should start off with an apology to the House for not mentioning IPA, the ASEAN Interparliamentary meetings, which in fact you all have hosted, the Speaker has chaired. That's been very important, that's been very useful, and I think it's also been particularly eye-opening for the younger members of Parliament to meet your counterparts from other ASEAN states, and more importantly, to see how these issues can paralyze us, can divide us, and how difficult, I mean, there were some resolutions where you can't even get it onto the agenda, much less agree on a resolution. So I apologize for not mentioning it. I should have, but I want to congratulate and I want to thank all of you who did participate in IPA, and I encourage you to continue participating as it moves on to other destinations as well. On RCEP, the statement was very carefully crafted. We reported substantial progress on the negotiations for the RCEP. In other words, not yet ready to declare conclusion. There are a couple of both negotiating as well as political considerations which have led to the current position where we can report substantial progress but not yet conclusion. Your question, what are the chances of it being done next year? Well, based on the leaders' pronouncement last week, I think all of them indicated their support for it to be concluded early 2019. Your next question, are there potential derailers? Of course there are potential derailers, including the fact that there are several elections next year. I'm not referring to Singapore.
Thank you, Minister. Just want to add that the performance by the Singapore MPs during IPA, led by Deputy Speaker Mr. Charles Chong, and the team of MPs was very impressive. Order. End of ministerial statement.